Hello there, today we are going to be revising Forrest Gump. Specifically, I'm going to be focusing on how the film depicts the contrast between the lives lived by Forrest and Jenny, and how their two lifestyles together encapsulate the whole American experience, at least in regards to the given historical eras that the film covers. Now, I was originally planning on making this a voiced over video essay, like a very serious, like I speak in a very deep, low voice, very serious. But I opted to present things a little less formally, as it is all my own interpretation. It's very scrappy. Video essays are fairly ironclad, very sure of themselves, as if what they're saying is gospel. And I didn't want to do things like that because this idea I have is far more theoretical and loose. It's just something that I wanted to get off my chest and talk about. This thing I'll be discussing is something that I've only just started to notice on my recent rewatches of the film, and it's something that really struck me. I'm not saying that I'm necessarily the first person to point this out or that I'm 100% right. It's just something theoretical that I find interesting. So Forrest Gump has always been a film that acts as a good showcase of American history through the 50s to 70s. In many ways, it's a whimsical mockery of America, as it depicts this naive, aimless and idiotic man stumble his way through historical events, giving Elvis the idea for his iconic dancing style, being in the All-American college football team and meeting Kennedy, fighting in Vietnam and getting the Medal of Honor, meeting Nixon and inadvertently setting off Watergate, founding the Bubba Gump Shrimp Company, almost shaping the entirety of America. Perhaps in having Forrest be instrumental in all of these events, it's trying to be a commentary on the stupidity of their conception. The simpleton who wasn't trying to achieve anything caused all of these things. Maybe highlighting how dumbfounded and accidental a lot of American history was. It's also quite telling that this man who more or less had no idea what he was doing was able to not only thrive but flourish in this incessantly optimistic world. The scene in which he's running across America comes to mind, where all of these journalists are asking why he's doing it. You're doing it for world peace, you're doing it for women's rights, they're trying to assign meaning to it. And in actuality, he just did it because he had this random impulse to start running. There's no deeper meaning, but everyone wants to believe that there's this higher reasoning to it.
They just couldn't believe that somebody would do all that running for no particular reason.
Why are you doing this?
I just felt like running.
Overall, I always saw the Forrest Gump character as a personification of America, as he emulates a lot of the traits we associate with that culture. The representation of a given part of America through Gump's persona is always something that I was fairly aware of with this film. I think we all were, seeing as though his story is the very focus of the film. However, what I didn't appreciate until only recently was what Jenny's story brought to the whole experience. She is the secondary character to this story and a little off to the side, but her narrative still takes up a large chunk of the film. And with her secondary storyline comes the contrast it has with the primary Forrest Gump storyline. Now, the story of Forrest Gump is one of heroism and accomplishment. He wades through some of the most traumatic moments in American history and comes out of it largely unscathed. He achieves a staggering amount of feats in life: All-American college football team member, ping pong champion, war hero, founder of one of the biggest American companies of all time, and he met 3 different US presidents amidst all of this. Forrest's whole existence and being embodies this traditional model American citizen, southern God-fearing patriot, athletic, brave, accomplished. He is in a lot of ways the American dream. His life is one big salute to the American flag. His life is romantic, adventurous and heartwarming. This is why the film acts as such an entertaining and accessible watch. It's such a digestible and familiar story structure. When you start to move over to Jenny's story, however, things become a lot more dreary. If we're going to quote the film that says life is like a box of chocolates, you never know what you're going to get, then surely Forrest picked out all of the more desirable chocolates and Jenny got all of the shit ones. Because her life is tragic. At many times does this film poignantly cut back to her to emphasise how worse off she's doing as compared to Forrest. When Forrest is training in the army, we find out that she got kicked out of college for posing in a Playboy magazine. So Forrest is flourishing in the military, meanwhile Jenny has not only squandered her academic potential, but knowing what Playboy is, has more than likely been sexually exploited for money. And then that point of sexual exploitation is driven home even further when Forrest goes to see her perform naked on stage in that gentleman's club. And Forrest is completely ignorant to what's happening. He's like, her dream had come true. She was a folk singer.
Her dream had come true.
She sleeps in the sand.
She was a folk singer.
Following this, the next time the two run into each other is after Forrest has served his time in the Vietnam War, and the two meet at the Capitol, an anti-Vietnam War rally. She's literally a hippie activist and he's a veteran, two politically opposing sides. They're always meeting on opposite sides of American history since they took the inverse life paths to one another.
Forrest, we have very different lives, you know.
Now, there are multiple ways in which you could define the contrast between Forrest and Jenny's two lives, and it's something that the film leaves nicely open and ambiguous. You can interpret whichever version you want, but I'm just going to now go through a few criterias by which you could compare their lives. In a lot of instances, it could be about comparing the male American experience with the female American experience. Jenny's story is one of constant exploitation and subjugation. Whilst Forrest lived a fairly idyllic life with his loving mother, Jenny lived with her abusive, drunken father who sexually molested her, giving her trauma that she would never fully heal from. She gets assaulted and beaten by numerous men throughout the film. I think it could also be an indication of the class divide, as Forrest grows up in this huge, nicely maintained house, and Jenny grows up in this horrible, rundown little shack. The poverty that Jenny grew up in did not lend for a very good start for her. She later suffers from severe drug addiction and even contemplates suicide. Jenny is put through the shredder throughout the course of this film. You have this depressing cut of Forrest lovingly painting her name on his boat, to seeing her doing a line of blow at a disco.
Now, I hadn't heard from Jenny in a long while.
Through Bubba Gump Shrimp, Forrest flourishes under capitalism while Jenny is just left to rot. Forrest Gump is described as this heartwarming feel-good movie, yet it contains all of these horrible unpleasantries that I honestly think we all crucially overlook when we remember this film. On a broader scope, I think the life of Forrest is supposed to represent all of the romantic aspects of American history. All of the things we, or at least Americans, nostalgically look back on and celebrate. Again, he lived a very patriotic life. Even some of the tragic aspects of his life still fit in with this traditional idea of the American way. Jenny, on the other hand, represents the counterculture, the more dreary parts of American history that we don't like to acknowledge as much. And maybe that's why in this very film her character is made secondary to Forrest, like she's sidelined. We don't really want to think about those aspects of American history, we just really want to bask in the nice moments. It often seems as if Jenny receives the brunt of all of the worst aspects of each given era. Exploited by the famous Playboy magazine, a victim of the influx of drugs in the 70s, and then finally a contractor of the HIV virus. As is the case with Back to the Future, which is another one of Robert Zemeckis' films who directed Forrest Gump, this film is rife with iconic imagery and pastiche. So many familiar historical events being presented visually to us that are instantly recognisable. It's an onslaught of famous American iconography, and it seems as though Forrest is always present for the positive and more glamorous iconography, whilst Jenny is present for all of the dour and seedy iconography. The film also separates the pair on a political front. Gump is a stand-in for the conservative and traditional values of America, whereas Jenny completely embodies the persona of the alternative liberal lifestyle, which at the time was a lifestyle that was largely frowned upon by many. She lives her life almost in direct opposition to what society at the time would have found more appealing, and Forrest is nicely ingratiated within the preferred American ideologies, even though this was not at all intentional. In many ways, Forrest and Jenny are constantly on opposing sides of a given movement or conflict, yet their story is not one of rivalry, but of a dysfunctional relationship. They literally embody two sides of America that we'd always perceive as being constantly at war with each other, yet this is a love story. They're part of each other, in spite of how adrift they may become, they always have that core connection. Their fates are ever bound, no matter how much the world tries to keep them apart. And for this film to showcase the duality of America like this, again, if we are going to go down this road of interpretation, It's quite a beautiful thing, saying that despite how tumultuous the relationship between these two ideological factions grows, there always remains that underlying love for one another. Removed from all of these events, groups and causes, what remains is this basic human care. This relationship has always been perceived as one where Jenny leads Forrest on and treats him awfully, and there is a certain amount of truth to that. But when you look at it this way, wherein they're just two repellent sides of American life, it makes sense that they can't ever properly come together and unionize.
We have very different lives, you know.
They live harmoniously together for a little while, but then that ends abruptly again. By this point, there's too much distance between them. I have admittedly started to veer towards overanalyzing, but I just wanted to express these thoughts. So I might be being a little bit flowery with my words, but fuck it. Something that negates this theory of Forrest's life embodying all of the positivity of American history and Jenny's embodying all of the negativity is that there are plenty of unpleasant or undesirable aspects of Forrest's journey too. For instance, he's very simple to the extent that he's practically handicapped, so he's got his own setbacks there. He had a single mother raising him, an utterly absent father, who was also of course in the Vietnam War, and that was obviously horrific. All of the scenes showcasing Lieutenant Dan's life after the war, also very depressing. Forrest had an ancestor who was in the KKK, and that's obviously not a good thing. However, that does still technically fit in with the idea of Forrest's life being the embodiment of the more traditional and conservative values of the American way, and that is of course an example where it goes to the extremely negative degrees. Forrest is just the original American culture, and Jenny is just everything that is contrary to that, perhaps. And that aforementioned pure traditional American culture definitely had its vile spots. In fact, it had a lot of those. In the eras in which this film takes place in, society was just far more rewarding to traditionalists and far less so to people who were living contrary to the strict American way. Hence, Forrest greatly benefits from this, but Jenny is left in the mud. Forrest's life, warts and all, is just inherently more palatable to the American population than Jenny's is. Again, one of his misfortunes involves fighting in the Vietnam War and sustaining an injury, but that is still something that can be turned into this romantic American story and looked back on admirably. Jenny was molested as a child, was sexually exploited by men all of her life, had severe substance abuse issues, and contemplated suicide. Nothing about any of these things could be remotely romanticised by history in the same way that Vietnam could be. It's as if Forrest was dealt all of the misfortunes that were the more glamorous to society. Jenny was dealt all of the misfortunes that people would rather not remember. And finally, where does this all lead? To the early 80s, where she contracts the HIV virus. AIDS, and then she fucking dies. The AIDS crisis, another thing that morbidly defined a given historical period. Jenny was a casualty of all of the least desirable aspects of American history. This uncooperative pair find each other in life once more, but her troubled past has already left its mark. They finally become a union as they get married, but Jenny knows she's not going to be around for much longer. Jenny laments on the fact that her life wasn't more congruent with Forrest's. This is when Forrest is telling her about all of these amazing moments in his life that carry great profundity.
I couldn't tell where heaven stopped and the earth began. It was so beautiful.
I wish I could have been there with you.
If only they could have coexisted more harmoniously. It's very tragic.
You died on a Saturday morning. I had you placed here under our tree.
She's probably only doing all of this for the sake of her child's future. This child can now thrive under the idyllic Forrest Gump-esque lifestyle. Now what does the child represent? Who knows? A new generation of America? Neoliberalism, maybe just a new persona of America, to put it vaguely. The two come together one last time to better the prospects of the child. They bulldoze Jenny's old house, symbolically righting the wrongs of the past and moving on. And finally, something that perhaps lends a little more credence to this theoretical interpretation of mine, is this monologue we get from Forrest when he's visiting the grave of Jenny.
I don't know if Mama was right or if it's Lieutenant Dan. I don't know.
He's looking back on all of the events of the film and wondering how purposeful life ultimately is. Do we all have our own set destinies, or is it more so chaotic and random? Is there any point to our suffering, etc.?
If we each have a destiny, or if we're all just floating around accidental like on a breeze.
He then suggests that maybe it's both. Maybe existence is meaningful, but at the very same time accidental.
Maybe it's both. Maybe both is happening at the same time.
Sometimes the stars align and great things happen, but at other times unfathomable cruelty befalls people. Life is a mix of destiny and chaos, perhaps. Mayhaps. And in this instance, if we're going back to these ideas of personification, Jenny would be the stand-in for the chaos of life, and Forrest would be the stand-in for the wonder of life. Only together do they encompass the true and full nature of reality. The history of America was both incoherent and poignant, both romantic and cruel, both idealistic and nihilistic. Life is both accidental and purposeful, but Jenny was still a victim of circumstance, and she eventually did succumb to all of the unpleasant and horrible things that were beset upon her, and her story, being the less favourable American narrative, was pushed aside. Jenny is the forgotten history of America. Even within this film, she is sidelined to make more room for the lavish story of Forrest Gump. One part survived and the other part perished, and with that we have the bittersweet ending of the Forrest Gump film. And with that, we're out. I hope you've enjoyed this Flat Earthers interpretation of the Forrest Gump film. I don't know how intentional any of this was, and I will admit that there is a high probability that I am overanalyzing, but I do think that this dichotomy within these two characters is very illustrative of the dual nature of the American experience. They are almost perfect opposites through so many different avenues of criteria, and I just found it all really fascinating. Long story short, Forrest was a Republican and Jenny was a libtard. I am not all-knowing, I am not Nerd Writer 1, I'm just expressing myself. Even though I didn't structure this in a neat video essay form, a lot of thought still went into this, so I'm not just winging it. Honestly, this format of video lends for a far more flexible way to get these ideas across. Maybe both are happening at the same time. So yeah, that's some food for thought for you. I just also like to say thank you again for all of the viewers the scary viewers who are always observing me. Obviously, this all depends on you, so I'm literally nothing without you, so big props to you guys. Give yourself a big wank on the back or whatever. That does not make any sense. I'm just trying to be edgy. You've been super, and I don't deserve you, and I'll do anything to appease my audience. Also, if you've gotten this far, you are a champion. You have gotten past one of the most indulgent videos on YouTube, so good on you. Wow,